Margaret Roberts had built an empire from coffee beans and spreadsheets, but she'd never learned how to build a life. At 62, she owned 17 cafes across 3 states, employed 200 people, and could recite profit margins like poetry. What she couldn't do was remember the last time someone had cooked her dinner, asked about her day, or held her hand without wanting something in return. Then she met David, a widowed father of 2, fixing her broken espresso machine with calloused hands and gentle patience. He had nothing she thought she needed, and everything she'd forgotten she'd lost. Some inheritances aren't about money. Some are about learning, finally, how to come home. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The espresso machine died at 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday, which was exactly the kind of Tuesday that made Margaret Roberts want to burn everything down. She stood in the narrow galley Kit Roberts of Bean there, her flagship cafe, watching steam hiss from the Italian beast that had cost more than most people's cars. The morning rush pressed against the windows, lawyers in wool coats, nurses ending night shifts, college students with tomorrow's assignments weighing down their shoulders, all of them needing caffeine. All of them her responsibility. "The Faema's acting up again," called Jamie from behind the counter, her voice pitched high with the particular anxiety of a 24-year-old assistant manager facing down a crowd of uncaffeinated Seattle professionals. Margaret pressed her palm against the machine's chrome surface. Still warm, still beautiful, still completely, utterly broken. At 62, Margaret had survived 3 recessions, 2 divorces, and 1 heart attack that she'd hidden from her employees by calling it food poisoning and working from the hospital bed. She'd built 17 cafes from a single cart and a $10,000 loan. She could read a P&L statement like scripture and negotiate lease terms that made landlords weep, but she couldn't fix an espresso machine. "Call Bruno," she said, referring to their usual repair guy. "He's in Portland until Thursday." Margaret closed her eyes. In the dining room, someone was drumming fingers on a table. The sound carried through the thin walls like a countdown. "What about that independent guy? David something?" Jamie consulted her phone. "David Reeves? He's got good Yelp reviews, but what? He's never worked on anything this fancy." Margaret looked at the Faema again. $17,000 of Italian engineering, dead as her grandmother's roses. Through the window, she could see people beginning to drift toward the Starbucks across the street. "Call him." David arrived 43 minutes later, which was 43 minutes of Margaret watching her carefully cultivated customer base hemorrhage into corporate coffee chains. She'd paced the length of the Kit Roberts so many times she'd worn a path in the industrial flooring. He knocked on the back door, polite, tentative, and when she opened it, she found a man in his early 40s with calloused hands and eyes the color of creek water after rain. He wore a faded flannel shirt and carried a toolbox that looked older than her business. "You called about an espresso machine?" His voice carried the slight rasp of someone who'd spent years breathing in coffee grounds and metal shavings. Margaret stepped aside to let him in. "Faema N&T 8 president," she said, gesturing toward the machine like she was introducing a difficult relative. "It's been temperamental for weeks, but this morning it just stopped." David approached the machine with the careful reverence of someone who understood that some things were worth more than their price tags. He ran his hands along the chrome panels, listening to something Margaret couldn't hear. "Beautiful machine," he said softly. "Can you fix it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened his toolbox, an ancient thing held together with duct tape and hope, and pulled out a stethoscope. Margaret watched him press it against various points on the machine, his face serious as a surgeon's. "The pump seized," he said finally. "Probably a calcium buildup in the lines. When's the last time you had it descaled?" Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Our previous technician handled all that." David's expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested he'd heard this story before. "It's an easy fix, but it'll take some time. I'll need to tear her down, clean everything, rebuild the pump mechanism. How long? Rest of the day, probably. Margaret looked through the pass-through window at her customers, most of whom were now clutching Starbucks cups like life preservers. We can't be down that long. I can work faster, but I can't work miracles. David's voice held no defensiveness. Just the quiet patience of someone who'd learned not to promise what he couldn't deliver. Your call. Margaret studied his face. No wedding ring, she noticed, though there was a pale band of skin where one might have been. His fingernails were clean but stained with a kind of oil that never quite washes out. Everything about him suggested competence without flash, reliability without guarantees. Fix it, she said. For the next 6 hours, Margaret tried to work in her office upstairs, but found herself drawn repeatedly to the Kit Roberts. David worked with a methodical precision that was somehow soothing to watch. He didn't talk much, just hummed occasionally under his breath, a tuneless melody that seemed to help him think. Around noon, Jamie brought him a sandwich and a coffee from the backup machine they used for decaf. Thanks, he said, accepting the coffee with both hands like it was a gift. You don't have to. You haven't stopped for lunch, Jamie said. Margaret gets cranky when people don't eat. Margaret, listening from the doorway, wanted to correct this. She wasn't cranky. She was concerned about productivity. About efficiency. About David caught her eye and smiled, and something in her chest loosened unexpectedly. Your boss seems like she cares about people, he said to Jamie, but his eyes stayed on Margaret. Jamie glanced between them with the gleeful expression of someone sensing potential drama. Oh, she does. Sometimes she pretends she doesn't, but she totally does. Jamie, Margaret said sharply. See? Jamie grinned and escaped back to the front counter. David took a bite of his sandwich turkey and Swiss, nothing fancy, and continued his work. Margaret watched him eat with the same careful attention he gave everything else, like he was someone who'd learned not to waste anything. You have kids? The question came out before Margaret had decided to ask it. David's hands stilled on the wrench he'd been using. 2. Emma's 8, Sam's 6. That must be. Nice. Margaret had no idea why she'd said that. She knew nothing about children, had actively avoided them for most of her adult life. It is, David said quietly, and terrifying, and exhausting. He looked up at her. You? No. The word came out sharper than she'd intended. Never seemed. I was always too busy building this. She gestured vaguely at the cafe, but somehow the gesture encompassed everything the empire she'd built, the life she'd chosen, the careful walls she'd constructed around herself. David nodded without judgment. My wife used to say I worked too much. Before the cancer. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with all the things that couldn't be fixed with tools and patience. I'm sorry, Margaret said, and meant it. 3 years ago, David said, returning to his work. The kids were so small. Emma barely remembers her mom without the headscarf. Margaret watched him reassemble a part of the machine with infinite care and wondered when she'd stopped noticing the weight of other people's grief. When had she become the kind of person who measured everything in profit margins and efficiency reports? How do you manage? She asked. 1 day at a time. Sometimes 1 hour at a time. David's hands never stopped moving as he spoke. My mother-in-law helps with pickup from school. Emma's getting pretty good at making mac and cheese. Sam's mastered the art of wearing the same pair of socks for 3 days straight without me noticing. Despite herself, Margaret smiled. Sounds like chaos. Complete chaos? David agreed. But it's our chaos. Something in the way he said "our" made Margaret's chest tighten. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been part of an hour that wasn't business-related. At 4:30, David finally stepped back from the machine. Try her now, he said. Margaret approached the Fiamma like she was greeting an old friend after a long absence. She pressed the brew button, and the machine responded with a soft hum that sounded almost like contentment. The espresso that emerged was perfect rich, golden crema, the kind of shot that reminded you why people fell in love with coffee in the first place. "How much do I owe you?" Margaret asked. David consulted a small notebook from his shirt pocket, his handwriting careful and precise. "Parts and labor, $2.40. Margaret stared at him. Bruno would have charged twice that and taken twice as long. "That's all?" It wasn't that complicated once I got inside her. David was already packing his tools. Just needed someone to pay attention to what she was trying to say. Margaret wrote the check, but didn't hand it over immediately. "David?" He looked up from closing his toolbox. "Thank you. Not just for the machine, for taking your time with her." Something shifted in David's expression, a recognition of the thing Margaret couldn't quite name, that some repairs went deeper than what showed on the surface. "She's a good machine," he said simply. "Just needed some care." Margaret handed him the check, and their fingers brushed briefly. His skin was warm, rough from work, entirely unlike the soft hands of the lawyers and executives she usually dealt with. After he left, Margaret stood in the empty Kit Roberts, listening to the Faema's quiet hum. Through the window, she could see David loading his toolbox into a battered pickup truck. He moved with the same careful efficiency he'd brought to her machine, but there was something else there too, a weariness that spoke of long days and small worries, of mac and cheese dinners, and bedtime stories read by someone who was learning, one day at a time, to be enough for two children who'd already lost too much. Margaret watched until his truck disappeared around the corner, then went upstairs to her office and tried to focus on quarterly reports. But all she could think about was the way he'd said, "our chaos." Like chaos could be something beautiful if it belonged to the right people. Margaret didn't expect to see David again for months, maybe years. The Faema was running perfectly, and she'd built her empire on the principle of not fixing what wasn't broken. But 3 weeks later, the grinder at her Capitol Hill location started making a sound like a dying cat, and before she could second-guess herself, she was scrolling through her contacts for his number. He answered on the second ring. "David Reeves. It's Margaret Roberts. From Being There." She paused, suddenly uncertain. "You fixed my espresso machine. I remember." There was warmth in his voice, like he'd been hoping she'd call. "What's going on?" "Different location, different problem. A grinder this time. Are you? Do you have time?" "I can be there in an hour." Margaret gave him the address and spent the next 60 minutes pretending to review inventory reports while actually watching the clock like a teenager waiting for a date. When David arrived at the Capitol Hill store, he brought with him the scent of autumn air and something else, cinnamon, maybe, or vanilla. Something that made Margaret think of Kit Roberts that were used for more than reheating takeout. "Smells like you've been baking," she said, then immediately regretted it. Too personal. Too interested. David looked down at his shirt, surprised. Emma had a school project, volcano cake. We may have gotten a little carried away with the frosting lava. The image of David in a Kit Roberts, flower in his hair, helping a small girl create geological disasters out of cake batter, hit Margaret with unexpected force. "Did it erupt properly?" she asked. "Spectacularly. Half the Kit Roberts is still orange." David grinned, and Margaret realized she'd never seen him smile like that, unguarded, proud, entirely present in the joy of a moment that existed only between him and his daughter. She led him to the grinder, an industrial Mahlkönig that had been her pride and joy until it started sounding like a garbage disposal eating aluminum foil. David listened to the machine the way other people listen to music, his head tilted slightly, fingers resting lightly on the chrome housing. "Bearings shot," he said after a moment. "I can fix it, but I'll need to order parts. Might take a few days." "That's fine." Margaret realized she'd answered too quickly. "I mean, we have backup equipment." David nodded and began his methodical disassembly. Margaret watched from behind the counter, ostensibly helping her afternoon manager with scheduling but actually studying the way David's hands moved, confident, gentle, never rushing. "Can I ask you something?" she said when the lunch rush had died down. "Sure. How did you learn to fix things? I mean, was it always coffee machines?" David paused in his work. "Started with cars, actually. My dad owned a garage in Spokane. Spent every summer there from the time I could hold a wrench." He smiled at the memory. "Coffee machines are just cars for caffeine. Same principles, things break down, you figure out why, you fix them." "And you like it? The fixing?" "I like that things can be fixed." David's voice carried a weight that suggested he was talking about more than machines. "That something broken doesn't have to stay broken." Margaret felt something twist in her chest. "Not everything can be fixed." "No," David agreed quietly. "But more things than people think." They worked in comfortable silence after that. David focused on the grinder, Margaret pretending to organize receipt spikes that were already perfectly organized. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors she'd had installed to make the space feel more like a living room than a business. Around 4 o'clock, a small commotion at the front door made them both look up. A woman in her 50s with David's eyes was shepherding 2 children inside a girl with dark pigtails and a boy whose shoelaces had clearly been tied by someone in a hurry. "Dad!" The girl ran toward David with the complete faith of a child who knew she would be caught. David set down his tools and scooped her up, spinning her once before settling her on his hip. The gesture was so natural, so practiced, that Margaret felt like she was witnessing something sacred. "Emma, Sam, this is Margaret," David said. "She owns this place." The boy, Sam, peered at Margaret with the solemn curiosity of a 6-year-old assessing a new adult. "Do you have cookies?" "Sam," the older woman chided gently. "What do we say?" "Please." Sam tried again. "Do you have cookies, please?" Margaret looked at the pastry case, which contained exactly 3 chocolate chip cookies and a sad-looking blueberry muffin left over from the morning rush. "We have cookies," she said, moving toward the case. "Would you like one?" "2," Sam said immediately. "One for Emma, too." Margaret glanced at David, who nodded. She plated the cookies and handed them over, watching as Sam immediately bit his in half and offered the larger piece to his sister. "That's very sweet of you," Margaret said, and meant it. "Sam's a good sharer," Emma said proudly, taking her half cookie. "Mom used to say sharing makes everything taste better." The casual mention of their mother hit the small group like a stone thrown into still water. David's face tightened almost imperceptibly. The older woman, their grandmother, Margaret realized, placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "That's right, sweetheart," she said. Mom was very wise about cookies. Margaret watched David during this exchange, saw the way he absorbed his children's casual grief and transformed it into something they could carry. It was like watching someone perform a magic trick in reverse. Instead of making pain disappear, he was making it bearable. "Are you fixing something else, Dad?" Emma asked, having apparently decided that Margaret was an acceptable cookie provider and therefore worthy of her father's attention. "Just a grinder. Should be done by Friday. Can we see?" David looked at Margaret, who found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided. "It's just a big machine that chops up coffee beans very finely," she explained as Emma approached the disassembled grinder. "Like my pencil sharpener?" "Exactly like that, but bigger." Emma studied the scattered parts with the intense focus of someone trying to understand how the world worked. "Dad fixes everything," she announced to Margaret. "He fixed my bike and the toaster and the thing in the bathroom that was making scary noises." "The toilet was just running," David said, but his cheeks had gone slightly pink. "It was very scary," Sam confirmed, having finished his cookie and moved on to examining the espresso machine, but Dad made it stop. Margaret found herself smiling at the children's easy confidence in their father's abilities. When had she last felt that kind of faith in another person? "We should go," the grandmother said, checking her watch. "Homework doesn't do itself." 5 more minutes? Emma pleaded. "Nice try, kiddo." David was already packing his tools. "Thanks for the cookies," he said to Margaret. "I'll call when the parts come in." Margaret watched them leave, David carrying his toolbox, Emma skipping beside him, Sam trailing behind, examining a small gear David had let him keep, the grandmother herding them all with the patient efficiency of someone who'd raised children before and was doing it again. After they left, the cafe felt too quiet. Margaret made herself a latte she didn't want and sat at the corner table where she usually reviewed reports. But instead of opening her laptop, she found herself staring out the window, thinking about the way Emma had offered her father a bite of her cookie without being asked, the way Sam had automatically shared his treat with his sister, the way David had looked at both of them like they were the most precious, complicated, exhausting gifts he'd ever received. Margaret had built 17 cafes and employed 200 people, but she couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her like she was a gift. Her phone buzzed. A text from her lawyer about the quarterly board meeting. Another from her accountant about tax implications of the new health insurance policy. A third from her sister in Portland, asking if she was still working too much, and when was she going to find a nice man and settle down, as if Margaret were 25 instead of 62, as if settling down were something she'd simply forgotten to do rather than actively avoided. Margaret deleted all 3 messages without responding. 3 days later, David called to say the parts had arrived. Margaret told him to come by after closing. She'd stay late to let him in. It was more convenient, she told herself. Fewer distractions. He arrived at 7:30 with his toolbox and a paper bag that smelled like Chinese takeout. "Figured you might not have eaten," he said, holding up the bag. "There's enough for 2 if you want." Margaret looked at the bag, then at David's face, hopeful but prepared for rejection, like someone who'd learned not to expect too much, but hadn't given up hoping entirely. "I haven't eaten," she admitted. They spread the takeout containers on one of the small tables near the window. Sweet and sour pork, fried rice, vegetable lo mein, nothing fancy. But it had been years since Margaret had shared a meal that wasn't a business dinner or an obligatory holiday gathering. "How long have you been fixing things?" Margaret asked, watching David use his chopsticks with the same careful precision he brought to machinery. "Professionally? About 5 years. Since Sarah got sick." David's voice was matter-of-fact, but Margaret could hear the weight underneath. Insurance covered most of the treatment, but not all. And someone needed to be home with the kids more. "Freelance repair work gave me flexibility." That must have been hard, the career change. Harder than losing someone you love? David shook his head. "The career change was easy, everything else." He trailed off, then seemed to gather himself. "But we managed. We're managing." Margaret set down her chopsticks. "Can I ask what she was like? Your wife?" David's face softened in a way that made Margaret's chest ache. Sarah was. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who left notes in the kids' lunch boxes, who could make friends with a brick wall if she set her mind to it. He smiled. "She would have liked you. You don't know that." "I do, actually." David met her eyes. "She always said the most interesting people were the ones who built something from nothing. She would have wanted to hear how you started with one coffee cart and built all this." Margaret felt heat rise in her throat. "It's just business, is it?" The question hung between them, simple and complicated all at once. Margaret looked around the cafe at the carefully chosen artwork, the mismatched vintage chairs she'd hunted down at estate sales, the small details that made each of her locations feel like a home rather than just another chain store. "I wanted to create places where people could belong," she said finally. "Where the coffee was good and the Wi-Fi worked and no one would rush you out if you needed to sit quietly for a while. That's not just business," David said gently. After they finished eating, David repaired the grinder while Margaret ostensibly worked on scheduling, but actually watched him transform a collection of broken parts back into something functional. His movements were hypnotic, methodical, patient, sure. "There," he said finally, stepping back as the grinder hummed to life. "Good as new." Margaret tested it with a small batch of beans. The grind was perfect, consistent, fine without being powdery. "Thank you. My pleasure." They stood in the quiet cafe, surrounded by the familiar sense of coffee and possibility. Margaret realized she didn't want him to leave. "David?" she said as he was packing his tools. "Yeah? Would you like to have dinner again sometime? Actual dinner, not takeout in a closed cafe." David's hand stilled on his toolbox. When he looked up, his expression was careful, considering. "Are you asking me on a date, Margaret?" The word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Margaret hadn't fully considered until he said it out loud. She started, then stopped. Was she? At 62, did she even remember how to date? "I don't know. Maybe?" David smiled then, the kind of smile that started slow and built into something that transformed his entire face. "I'd like that," he said. "Fair warning, though I'm out of practice, and I come with complications." Margaret thought about Emma and Sam, about bedtime stories and school projects and the 1,000 small responsibilities that came with being someone's entire world. "I like complications," she said, and surprised herself by meaning it. Their first real date was a disaster. Margaret had chosen the restaurant, a quiet Italian place in Belltown, where she'd taken clients for years, where the maitre d' knew her usual table and the sommelier could recommend wines that complemented quarterly projections. But David arrived 20 minutes late, his shirt wrinkled, his hair still damp from what appeared to be a hasty shower. He slid into the booth across from her with the harried expression of someone who'd just survived a small war. "I'm so sorry," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Emma had a meltdown about her science project, and then Sam decided tonight was the perfect time to flush one of his action figures down the toilet, and my mother-in-law got stuck in traffic. He trailed off, finally looking at Margaret's face. She'd been sitting there for 23 minutes, watching other couples share appetizers and wondering if this had been a mistake, wondering if she'd misread everything. "We can reschedule," David said quietly. I should have known better. Single parents don't get to have dinner dates that start on time." Margaret looked at his tired eyes, at the small stain on his shirt that was probably ketchup or finger paint or one of the 1,000 substances that seemed to follow children around like tiny, messy satellites. "Did you eat?" she asked. "What? Did you have dinner? Before you left?" David shook his head. "There wasn't time. I grabbed a granola bar." Margaret signaled the waiter. "2 orders of the seafood pasta," she said, "and a bottle of the Chianti Classico." David looked at her with something approaching wonder. "You're not angry?" "I'm learning," Margaret said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was learning, only that it had something to do with the way plans could be less important than the people you made them with. The dinner improved from there. David told her about Emma's science project, a solar system model that had somehow become an artistic interpretation of cosmic chaos. Margaret found herself laughing at his description of Sam's negotiation tactics regarding bedtime, the elaborate contracts her 6-year-old drew up that included clauses about one more story and water that isn't too cold or too warm. "They sound exhausting," Margaret said. "They are." David's voice carried no complaint, only the weary pride of someone who'd chosen to love the most complicated people in his world. "But they're everything, you know. Before Sarah died, I thought I knew what love was. But watching your kids figure out how to be brave when their world falls apart, that changes you." Margaret set down her wine glass. "How do you do it? Raise them alone?" "Badly, most days." David smiled, but there was pain underneath it. "I burn dinner and forget picture day, and sometimes I find myself having conversations with an 8-year-old about why people die, and I have no idea what I'm doing, but they're still here, and they're still laughing, so I must be doing something right." Margaret thought about her own childhood boarding schools and nannies and parents who loved her, but expressed it through tuition payments and trust funds. She'd learned early that love was a transaction, that affection had terms and conditions. "I wouldn't know how to do it," she said. "Be responsible for someone else's happiness." "You do it every day," David said. "Your employees, your customers. You've created something that makes people feel taken care of. That's different. That's business." "Is it?" David leaned forward. "When Jamie talks about you, she doesn't sound like someone discussing her boss. She sounds like someone talking about family." Margaret felt something uncomfortable shift in her chest. I'm not good at family. Maybe you just haven't had the right practice." After dinner, David walked her to her car, a sensible BMW that reflected her personality in all the ways she'd thought mattered. Reliable, efficient, successful. But standing next to David's battered pickup truck, it looked cold somehow, untouchable. "Thank you," David said as she fumbled for her keys. "For dinner. For being patient with my chaos. Thank you for sharing it with me." They stood in the parking garage, surrounded by the echo of their voices and the distant hum of the city. Margaret realized she didn't want to get in her car and drive back to her empty condo, back to the carefully organized life that suddenly felt less like success and more like a beautifully appointed prison. "David?" "Yeah?" "Next time, maybe we could do something easier, less formal." David's face lit up with something that might have been relief. "I know a great taco truck, very kid-friendly, in case babysitting falls through again." Margaret smiled. "I'd like that." But the next time didn't happen for 3 weeks. Margaret got pulled into crisis management when her Fremont location failed a health inspection and David's mother-in-law broke her ankle, leaving him to juggle single parenthood without backup. They texted occasionally, David sending her photos of Sam's latest artistic endeavors, finger paintings that looked like abstract expressionist masterpieces. Margaret sharing updates about the health inspector's personal vendetta against her milk steaming technique. The texts were small things, easy things, but they created a rhythm Margaret hadn't expected. Someone asking how her day went. Someone to tell about the customer who'd tried to pay for his latte with a hand-drawn coupon for one free hug. When they finally managed to coordinate schedules again, David suggested something Margaret had never done in her adult life, a Saturday afternoon at the zoo. "With the kids?" Margaret asked when he called. "They're part of the package," David said. "But I understand if that's too." "I'd like to meet them properly," Margaret heard herself say. "Emma and Sam." "You sure?" "They're a lot." Margaret thought about her weekends usually spent reviewing reports, visiting her cafes, or sitting in her pristine condo reading business journals. When had she last done something just for the joy of it? I'm sure. The Woodland Park Zoo on a Saturday afternoon was everything Margaret's carefully ordered world was not. Chaotic, loud, sticky, full of children shrieking with delight and parents wearing the glazed expression of people who'd been answering why questions for several consecutive hours. Emma and Sam had apparently prepared for Margaret's visit like diplomats preparing for a summit. Emma wore her best dress purple with unicorns and had practiced her handshake. Sam had drawn her a picture of what he explained was her as a lion, but a nice lion who owns coffee shops. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, accepting the drawing with more ceremony than she'd given most business contracts. "Should I roar?" "Only if you want to," Sam said seriously. "Some lions are quiet lions." They spent the afternoon wandering from exhibit to exhibit. Margaret found herself paying less attention to the animals than to the small dramas unfolding around her. Emma's patient explanation of why elephants needed big ears. Sam's detailed negotiation about which animal they should visit next. David's easy navigation of childhood crises, both Major Sam's dropped ice cream and minor Emma's temporary concern that the giraffes looked sad. At the penguin exhibit, Emma slipped her small hand into Margaret's. "They mate for life," Emma announced, watching a pair of penguins waddle together across the artificial ice. "Dad told me that means they stay together forever." Margaret looked down at the little girl beside her, then at David, who was hoisting Sam up for a better view. "That's very romantic," she said. "Do you think they're happy?" Emma asked. "The penguins?" Margaret watched the paired birds moving in synchrony, their lives intertwined in ways that seemed both simple and impossibly complex. "I think they're content," she said finally. "Sometimes that's better than happy." Emma considered this with the gravity of someone much older. "Dad says Mom is happy now, but that she was also happy with us." "Before." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "What do you think?" "I think maybe there are different kinds of happy," Emma said, "and maybe you can have more than one kind in your whole life." Margaret squeezed the small hand in hers. "I think you're very wise. That's what Dad says. Sam thinks I'm weird, but Dad says weird is just another word for interesting." By the time they left the zoo, Margaret's feet hurt. Her jacket was stained with something that might have been cotton candy, and she couldn't remember when she'd last spent 4 hours without checking her phone once. At the parking lot, David loaded the exhausted children into their car seats while Margaret stood awkwardly beside her BMW, unsure of the protocol for ending a day that had felt nothing like a date and everything like something she couldn't name. "Thank you," David said, approaching her as Emma and Sam argued sleepily about which animals had been the most impressive. They had a great time. "So did I." David studied her face. "You sound surprised." "I am surprised." Margaret looked back at the zoo, at the family streaming toward their cars, everyone tired and happy and covered in the residue of a day well spent. "I don't usually. This isn't really my world." "What is your world?" Margaret thought about her answer. "Quiet, organized, predictable." "Boring?" David asked, but gently. "Safe?" Margaret corrected. David nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant. "Safe has its place. But so does messy." As Margaret drove home to her silent condo, she found herself thinking about Emma's words, different kinds of happy, the possibility of having more than one kind in a whole life. She'd built her happiness around certainty, around control, around the satisfaction of creating something lasting and successful. But sitting in her perfectly appointed living room, looking at Sam's lion drawing propped against her coffee table, Margaret wondered if she'd confused happiness with contentment, achievement with fulfillment. Her phone buzzed, a text from David. "Emma wants you to know the lions were her second favorite part of today. You were first." Margaret stared at the message until the screen went dark, then stared at her own reflection in the black surface. When had she last been someone's favorite part of anything? She typed back, "What about Sam?" The response came immediately. Sam said, "You're the nicest quiet lion he's ever met." Margaret laughed out loud in her empty condo, and the sound surprised her. When had she last laughed at home? When had home been a place for laughter? She looked around her living room at the expensive art that matched the expensive furniture, at the carefully curated books she'd never had time to read, at the life she'd built that looked perfect from the outside and felt increasingly hollow from within. "Same time next weekend?" she typed. "The kids would love that. So would I." Margaret set her phone aside and went to her Kit Roberts to make tea. As the kettle heated, she found herself humming a tuneless melody that sounded surprisingly like the one David hummed while he worked. For the first time in years, her condo felt less like a showcase and more like a place where someone lived. Someone who was learning, maybe, to want more than just safety from her one wild and precious life. The heart attack came on a Thursday morning at 6:47 a.m., while Margaret was reviewing supply orders in her office above the flagship store. One moment she was calculating the cost differential between Ethiopian and Colombian beans. The next, she was on her knees beside her desk, her left arm on fire and her chest compressed by an invisible vice. The paramedics found her 23 minutes later, after Jamie had come upstairs to ask about the afternoon delivery schedule and discovered her boss gray-faced and gasping on the industrial carpet. At Northwest Hospital, Dr. Sarah Patel, a woman Margaret's age with kind eyes and steady hands, explained that Margaret had experienced what they called a widowmaker, a massive blockage in her left anterior descending artery. "You're lucky," Dr. Patel said, after the emergency angioplasty. "Another 20 minutes and we'd be having a very different conversation." Margaret stared at the ceiling tiles of her hospital room, counting the small holes punched in the acoustic material. Lucky. She'd built 17 businesses, employed 200 people, and could have died alone on her office floor, and they were calling it lucky. "Do you have family we should call?" Dr. Patel asked gently. "Someone who can stay with you for the first few days?" Margaret thought about her sister in Portland, remarried, busy with grandchildren, their relationship maintained through holiday cards and dutiful phone calls on birthdays. She thought about her employees, who cared about her but shouldn't have to, who had their own lives to worry about. "I'm fine on my own," Margaret said. Dr. Patel's expression suggested she'd heard this particular lie before. "Mrs. Roberts, you've had a major cardiac event. The next few weeks are critical for your recovery. You shouldn't be alone." But alone was what Margaret knew. Alone was safe, predictable, manageable. Alone didn't disappoint you or leave you or demand more than you were prepared to give. Except. David had been texting her every morning for 3 weeks, usually something small and silly, a photo of Sam's latest breakfast sculpture, a quote from Emma's ongoing philosophical inquiries about why grown-ups had to work when kids got to learn new things every day. Except she'd started looking forward to those texts, had caught herself checking her phone more frequently, had begun to shape her days around the small moments of connection they provided. Except when she closed her eyes, she could see Emma's small hand in hers at the penguin exhibit, could hear Sam's serious explanation of his lion drawing, could feel the unfamiliar warmth of being someone's favorite part of the day. "There might be someone," Margaret said quietly. Dr. Patel waited, "but I don't know if I should call him." "Why not?" Margaret tried to find words for the thing she'd spent 3 weeks not examining too closely. That David represented everything she'd convinced herself she didn't need: complications, messiness, the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone matter, that she was 62 and learning to want things she'd given up on decades ago. That wanting felt dangerous when you'd built your entire life around not needing anything you couldn't control. "It's complicated," Margaret said finally. "Most worthwhile things are," Dr. Patel said, "but complicated doesn't mean impossible." After the doctor left, Margaret stared at her phone for an hour before finally typing, "I'm in the hospital. Heart attack. I'm okay, but I thought you should know." David's response came within minutes. "Which hospital?" "I'm coming." "You don't need to, Margaret." "Which hospital?" she told him. He arrived 47 minutes later with 2 cups of coffee from her flagship store, his hair damp from another hasty shower, his eyes carrying the particular mixture of fear and relief she remembered from the early days after Sarah's diagnosis. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into the uncomfortable visitor's chair beside her bed. "Like I got hit by a truck. A very precise medical truck." David smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Scared me," he said quietly. "Your text. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize for having a heart attack, Margaret." They sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the particular hush of hospitals where people learn to speak in careful voices about uncertain futures. "The kids?" Margaret asked. "At my mother-in-law's. They don't know yet. I wasn't sure." David hesitated. "I wasn't sure what you'd want me to tell them." Margaret felt something twist in her chest that had nothing to do with blocked arteries. "They barely know me. Emma asked why you haven't come over for dinner yet. She's been practicing her table-setting skills specifically for when you visit. The image of Emma carefully arranging silverware, preparing for an invitation Margaret had been too afraid to accept, made her throat tight. "I'm not good at this," Margaret said. "At what?" "Letting people." She gestured vaguely at the hospital room, at David's presence, at the coffee he'd brought that was still warm, despite the drive across the city. "I don't know how to let people take care of me." David set his coffee cup on the bedside table and leaned forward in his chair. "Can I tell you something?" Margaret nodded. "After Sarah died, Emma stopped eating for 3 days. Just refused food completely. The grief counselor said it was normal, that kids sometimes try to control the only thing they can when their world falls apart. But I was terrified. Here I was, this guy who was supposed to keep her alive, and she wouldn't eat." David's hands were clasped in his lap, his knuckles white. "On the 4th day she asked if she could make me breakfast. Cereal and toast, nothing fancy. But she wanted to take care of me because she'd figured out that sometimes taking care of someone else is how you learn to take care of yourself." Margaret looked at David's face, at the careful way he was telling her this story, and understood that he was offering her something precious, not just the story, but the lesson buried inside it. "You think I need to learn to be taken care of, so I can learn to take care of other people? I think maybe you already know how to take care of people. Maybe you just need to learn that it goes both ways." Margaret thought about Jamie bringing her lunch when she worked too late, about her Fremont manager who always asked about her weekend plans, about the customers who knew her name and her usual order, about all the ways she'd been loved without recognizing it as love. "The doctor says I can't go back to work for at least a month," Margaret said. "Good. It's not good. I have 17 locations, 200 employees, who will manage perfectly well without you for a month," David interrupted gently. "The world won't end if Margaret Roberts takes a break." Margaret wanted to argue, but the exhaustion was pulling at her, and David's voice was steady and sure, and something about the way he said her name made her believe, for a moment, that she might be more than just the sum of her responsibilities. "Will you stay?" she asked, the words coming out smaller than she'd intended. "Just until I fall asleep?" David settled back in his chair. "I'll stay as long as you need." Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the sound of David's breathing, steady and patient. Somewhere beyond her room, the hospital continued its careful orchestration of healing nurses padding through corridors, monitors beeping their electronic lullabies, families learning to hope in waiting rooms that smelled like disinfectant and coffee. But in her room, there was only the quiet presence of someone who'd chosen to stay, and the unfamiliar comfort of not having to be strong enough for both of them. When Margaret woke 6 hours later, David was still there. He'd pulled out a small notebook and was sketching something technical drawings with precise measurements, the kind of diagrams he probably made before tackling complicated repairs. "What are you working on?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. David looked up, startled. "How are you feeling?" "Better." "What's the drawing?" David held up the notebook. The sketch showed what appeared to be a Kit Roberts layout: cabinets, countertops, an island with bar stools. "Emma's been asking when you're coming to dinner. I realized our Kit Roberts table only seats 4, and if you're going to be part of—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "I thought maybe I should build something bigger." Margaret stared at the sketch. David had drawn her into his family's future with the same methodical care he brought to fixing broken things. Had measured space for her in his home like she was something permanent, something that belonged. "You don't even know if I can cook," Margaret said. "Can you?" "No. I heat things up. I make coffee. I order takeout with the efficiency of someone who's been doing it for 20 years. David grinned. "Good thing I can cook." "David," Margaret started, then stopped. "How did you tell someone that you'd spent your entire adult life convinced that love was a luxury you couldn't afford, and that sitting in a hospital bed, watching him sketch furniture to accommodate your presence in his children's lives, felt like waking up from a dream you hadn't realized you were having?" "What is it?" "I'm scared," she said simply. "Of what?" "Of wanting this too much." of not being enough, of you realizing that I'm better at running businesses than being part of families." David set down his notebook and moved to sit on the edge of her bed. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" She nodded. "When you decided to build your first cafe, were you scared?" "Terrified. But you did it anyway." "That was different. That was business. This is life," David said quietly. "It's scarier than business, but it's also more important." Margaret looked at David's face, at the sketch of a Kit Roberts table big enough for all of them, at the careful way he was holding her future in his calloused hands. "What if I'm not good at it? What if you are?" Outside her window, Seattle was settling into evening. Lights were coming on in office buildings where people were working late, in apartments where families were gathering for dinner, in coffee shops where strangers were becoming friends over shared tables and common ground. Margaret had spent her life building places where people could belong. Maybe it was time to learn how to belong somewhere herself. "Okay," she said. "Okay? Okay, I want to try. The dinner table, the complications, all of it." David's smile was like watching the sun come up after a very long night. "Fair warning," he said. "Emma's going to want to plan the menu. Sam's going to insist on a centerpiece made entirely of action figures. And I'm probably going to burn whatever I try to cook for our first official family dinner." Margaret felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "I can't wait," she said, and realized she meant it. Recovery was nothing like Margaret had imagined. For a woman who'd run 17 businesses with military precision, the enforced stillness felt like a particular kind of torture. But David had moved her into his guest room just until you're steadier on your feet, he'd said, and suddenly Margaret found herself living inside the warm chaos she'd only glimpsed from the outside. Emma brought her drawings every morning with her breakfast, elaborate princesses with coffee cup crowns, lions who owned businesses and wore tiny suits. Sam appointed himself her personal entertainer, performing elaborate puppet shows using action figures and a cardboard box theater he'd constructed with David's help. "The red robot is you," Sam explained during one particularly complex performance. "She's fighting the bad guy who makes people's hearts stop working." Margaret watched the small boy orchestrate battles between good and evil with the serious intensity of someone who understood that stories were how you made sense of a world that didn't always make sense on its own. "Does the red robot win?" Margaret asked. "Always," Sam said confidently. "She's very brave." David worked from the Kit Roberts table during the day, his laptop surrounded by coffee cups and homework assignments and the general debris of a household where business and family occupied the same space. Margaret watched him field phone calls about broken ice machines while simultaneously helping Emma with her spelling words and wondered how he made it look effortless. "Don't you ever want to run away?" Margaret asked one afternoon while Emma and Sam were at school and the house had settled into temporary quiet. David looked up from his laptop, where he'd been scheduling repair calls around parent-teacher conferences. "Every day," he said. "Usually around 3:47 p.m. when I'm trying to make dinner and help with homework and pretend I understand Common Core math. But you don't. Where would I go?" David's voice was matter of fact. "This is my life. These are my people. You don't run away from people you love just because loving them is hard." Margaret absorbed this, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle piece that might fit into a larger picture she was still learning to see. 2 weeks into her convalescence, Jamie visited with reports from the cafes and a stack of documents that needed Margaret's signature. But instead of the usual detailed briefings Margaret expected, Jamie seemed more interested in the refrigerator art gallery Emma had curated in Margaret's honor. "She's really talented," Jamie said, examining a drawing of what appeared to be Margaret and Emma having tea with a family of unicorns. "She's 8, Margaret said. "So? I couldn't draw like this when I was 8, or 18 for that matter." Jamie turned away from the refrigerator. "You look better, by the way. Rested." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I've been sleeping a lot." "You've been happy," Jamie corrected. "There's a difference." That evening, After David had helped Sam with his reading and Emma had demonstrated her newest dance routine, Margaret found herself in the Kit Roberts washing dishes, something she couldn't remember doing in her own home in years. "You don't have to do that," David said, appearing beside her with a dish towel. "I want to." Margaret realized this was true. There was something soothing about the warm water, the simple task, the way clean plates accumulated in the drying rack like small accomplishments. David began drying the dishes she'd washed, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret nodded. "What happens when you're cleared to go back to work? To your life?" The question Margaret had been avoiding settled between them like a stone thrown into still water. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Do you want to go back? To the way things were?" Margaret considered this as she scrubbed a pot that Sam had used to make soup out of playground dirt and dandelions. 3 weeks ago the question would have been absurd. Of course she wanted to go back. Her cafes were her life's work, her legacy, the thing that proved she'd existed and mattered. But standing in David's Kit Roberts, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on different principles, love letters disguised as children's artwork, a calendar dense with school events and repair appointments, the comfortable clutter of people who belonged to each other, Margaret found herself questioning everything she'd thought she wanted. "I used to think my cafes were my children," she said finally. "That building the business was the most important thing I could do with my life. And now I think maybe I confused being needed with being loved." David set down his dish towel and turned to face her fully. "What's the difference?" Margaret thought about Jamie's morning reports, delivered with the efficiency of someone managing a problem rather than sharing a life. About board meetings where she was valued for her decisions, not her dreams. About the careful distance she'd maintained between herself and everyone who depended on her. "People need me because of what I can do for them," Margaret said. "But Emma draws me pictures because she wants me to have them. Sam performs puppet shows because he thinks I might enjoy them. She paused, searching for words. "You don't need me to fix anything or solve anything or make anything more efficient. You just want me here. Is that enough?" David's voice was careful, like someone asking a question whose answer might change everything. Margaret looked around the Kit Roberts at Emma's homework spread across the table, at Sam's latest art project, drying on the counter, at the life David had built from love and necessity, and the daily choice to show up for people who needed him to be steady. "It's everything," she said. David kissed her then, soft and sure, tasting like coffee and possibility. When they broke apart, Margaret realized she was crying. "What's wrong?" David asked. "Nothing's wrong," Margaret said, wiping her eyes. I've never been someone's choice before. Not like this. Margaret?" David's hands cupped her face gently. "You're not just my choice. You're our choice. All of us." As if summoned by his words, Emma appeared in the Kit Roberts doorway, her hair braided for bed, her favorite stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. "Are you crying happy tears or sad tears?" Emma asked, with the directness of someone who'd learned to read adult emotions as a survival skill. "Happy tears?" Margaret said. "Good." Emma climbed onto a Kit Roberts chair and reached for Margaret's hand. "Dad cries happy tears sometimes too. Usually when Sam does something really funny or when I remember to put my dishes in the dishwasher without being asked. Those sound like excellent reasons for happy tears," Margaret said solemnly. "They are." Emma swung their joined hands. "Margaret? Yes, sweetheart? When you're all better, will you still live with us?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, like a test, like an invitation to a future Margaret had never dared to imagine. Margaret looked at David, who was watching her, with the careful hope of someone who'd learned not to assume anything about the people he loved. She looked at Emma, whose 8-year-old heart was generous enough to make space for another adult in her carefully reconstructed family. "Would you like me to?" Margaret asked. "Yes," Emma said immediately. Sam thinks so too, but he's too shy to ask, and Dad smiles more when you're here. Margaret felt something settle in her chest, like a piece of machinery that had finally been properly adjusted. Then yes, she said, I'd like that very much. Emma beamed and threw her arms around Margaret's waist. Can we tell Sam? He's been practicing asking you himself, but he keeps getting scared. We'll tell him together, Margaret said. Tomorrow, at breakfast. After Emma had been tucked back into bed, Margaret and David sat on the front porch, sharing a cup of tea and watching the neighborhood settle into sleep. Are you sure about this? David asked quietly. About us? About giving up your independence? Margaret considered the question. Independence had been her religion for 40 years, the thing she'd worshipped and protected and never questioned. But sitting on David's porch, listening to the sound of his children breathing safely in their beds, she realized that independence without connection wasn't freedom. It was just a very comfortable kind of loneliness. I'm not giving up my independence, Margaret said. I'm choosing interdependence. There's a difference. What about your business? Margaret had been thinking about this for days. I'm going to step back. Not retire completely, but delegate more. Let Jamie and the other managers handle the day-to-day operations. And do what instead? Margaret smiled. Learn to be part of a family. Figure out how to cook something besides coffee. Help Sam with his puppet shows. Teach Emma about running a business, if she's interested. She's been asking if she can work at one of your cafes when she turns 16. Has she? Margaret felt a warm pride that surprised her. What did you tell her? That she'd have to ask you herself. Margaret imagined Emma at 16, confident, curious, ready to take on the world. I'd like that. Having her work with me. They sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the sounds of a neighborhood at rest. Dogs barking in distant yards, the soft whoosh of cars on nearby streets, the rustle of leaves in trees that had been growing longer than either of them had been alive. David, Margaret said finally. Thank you for letting me be part of this, for teaching me that love isn't something you have to earn. David reached for her hand. Thank you for choosing us, for being brave enough to want something messy and complicated and wonderful. Margaret squeezed his fingers, these hands that fixed broken things and built Kit Roberts tables and held children during thunderstorms. I love you, she said, the words coming out easier than she'd expected. I love you too. Inside the house, a small voice called out Sam, probably needing water or having a bad dream or simply wanting to know that the adults were still there, still watching over him. David started to get up, but Margaret stopped him. Let me, she said. She found Sam sitting up in his bed, his hair sticking up at impossible angles, his face creased with the particular confusion of someone awakened from deep sleep. I had a dream about the red robot, he said when he saw Margaret in his doorway. A good dream or a scary dream? Good. She was making coffee for all the other robots, and they were really happy about it. Margaret sat on the edge of his bed. That sounds like a very good dream. Margaret? Sam's voice was small in the darkness. Yes? Are you going to stay with us forever? The question was so direct, so trusting, that Margaret felt her throat tighten. Would you like me to? Sam nodded solemnly. You make Dad smile the way he used to when Mom was here. But different. Like, he screwed up his face in concentration, like maybe there can be different kinds of happy in the same house. Margaret thought about Emma's words at the Penguin exhibit, about the wisdom of children who'd learned too young that love could take many forms. I'm going to stay as long as you want me here, Margaret said. Good. Sam settled back into his pillows. Can you tell Dad that the red robot is going to help us make pancakes tomorrow? I think she'd be really good at pancakes. I think she would be too, Margaret said. She sat with Sam until his breathing deepened into sleep, then made her way back through the house past Emma's room, where drawings of their future family covered every surface, past the Kit Roberts where she and David had washed dishes and planned their life together, past the living room where 3 people had learned to become 4. On the porch, David was still waiting. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Everything's perfect," Margaret said, and realized that for the first time in her life, she meant it completely. The next morning, the red robot made pancakes. They were slightly burned and completely delicious. And Margaret Roberts, businesswoman, entrepreneur, practical woman who'd built her life on logic and efficiency, discovered that some of the best things in life couldn't be measured in profit margins or quarterly reports. They could only be measured in the space between heartbeats, in the sound of children laughing over breakfast, in the way love could fix the things you didn't even know were broken. Some inheritances aren't about money. Some are about learning, finally, how to come home.